first speaker is Professor Peter Mandler. Professor Mandler is a professor of modern cultural history at the University of Cambridge and Bailey College lecturer in history at Gonville and Keyes College. From 2012 to 2016, he served as president of the Royal Historical Society, and from 2020 to 2023, he served as the president of the Historical Association. He is a fellow of the British Academy and of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Professor Mandler writes on the cultural, social, and intellectual history of Britain since the 1800s, and on the history of the humanities and the social sciences in the English-speaking world. Peter, please.
Thank you, Galia. How can I compete with the borax pet? Probably in years to come, your memories of this symposium will be primarily about Anat and her wonderful book, and then subsidiarily about the borax pet, and all the academic speakers will vanish into amnesia. Well, in any case, I'm delighted to be here. I haven't been in Israel for, I think, 10 years. My wife, who's with me, hasn't been here for 40 years. We've seen lots of changes. And of course, we've come in a very eventful week, and I've been glad to see some of that as well. Congratulations to you for reviving the spirit of civic engagement, which should be a tradition of this country. I see my role, in fact all of our roles, as having two functions. Tribute to Anat and engagement with her book. Anat chooses difficult problems and proposes difficult solutions. And for avoidance of doubt, I'm aware that there's a long tradition of calling women difficult in a derogatory way. But of course, I mean difficult, as I know everyone here recognizes, as that highest term of academic praise possible. It's what we do when we're at our best. We look for problems that are not obvious, that require extended consideration, and for historians, extended documentation, which is why it takes us a long time to write our books. This also, however, gives our books longer shelf lives, much longer than many other disciplines, even other disciplines that do publish in book form. And it means that our books repay reading, and reading, and rereading. And I went back and read through both of Anat's books, and can only say how much they do reward rereading and spark more thought. And these are the thoughts that have been sparked by my rereading of Anat's books. Once upon a time, there was a burgeoning field called Victorian Studies. Its roots can be found in the 1950s. It flourished in the 1960s and 70s. But since then, it has withered. And I'm aware there are Victorianists here present. I mean, I consider myself to be one. But let me explain. Given how tight disciplinary constraints can be, the emergence of such an interdisciplinary field usually betokens some powerful motivations. In this case, they were, perhaps unpredictably, liberal and social democratic motivations, reflecting a mounting social conscience among academics in both the US and the UK. I mean, before that, people studied Victorian culture to worship at the shrine of great works of art, great novels particularly. But Victorian studies gave people other reasons to re-examine that terrain. This social conscience drew attention to the social problems of the Victorian period, notably problems of poverty, proletarianization, urban sprawl, and latterly sexual repression and gender differentiation. You can see these motivations in the surge of interest in the so-called Condition of England novels and social criticism of the 1830s and 40s, and in what was known as the Dios School of Urban History, inspired by the great urban historian at the University of Leicester, H.J. Dios. Topics which intersected in that great climactic document of Victorian studies, the lavishly illustrated 2-volume Victorian City book project, edited by Dios and Wolfe and published in 1973. And that was, in some ways, the sort of high point of the high tide of Victorian studies. Now, it may be controversial, it may not even be accurate to say that Victorian studies has withered since then. The journal of that name still flourishes, So do Victorian studies associations in both the US and the UK. There are Victorianists aplenty still, mostly in literature departments, though fewer in history departments. But the interdisciplinary project has faded, perhaps with fading hopes in the social conscience of the period. Those tight disciplinary constraints have blown apart many fledgling Victorian studies programs, and no one now hires in the field of Victorian studies, and not so many even in Victorian literature or history. Nevertheless, if the field doesn't exist as it once did, there are scholars who carry on its spirit. Notably, there is a loose cluster of scholars, more often with literary than with historical origins, who continue to study Victorian liberalism, or now more often recognized explicitly as Victorian capitalism, as not just a political affiliation, liberal, or a form of political economy, but as a way of life. I'm thinking of the likes of Elaine Hadley, whose book Living Liberalism of 2010 states its intentions in the title. Lauren Goodlad, author of, among other books, Victorian Literature and the Victorian State, Character and Governance in a Liberal Society, published in 2003. And Amanda Anderson, whose book Bleak Liberalism, 2016, which follows a similar path to Hadley's. And these have all been books which have had an impression on my own thinking. And Anat, of course, is another one of those scholars. Unusually, she combines history and literature with the law. I say unusually, but in this context, it is far from incongruous. The law offers an obvious alternative text to literature as a window on Victorians' way of living in a liberal society, and not one that's turned to as often as Victorian novels are by young people. Among the scholars I've mentioned, Anderson cites Derrida and Agamben as taking a view of law as an external authority, an act of violence or exception that dehumanizes and demoralizes, whereas Anderson wishes to see the law as part of lived experience, a challenge to be met at least, and possibly also a context within which truth and justice might be maintained. She is keen to insist that for her, liberalism is not just a challenge, but an opportunity for active and constructive engagement. Anat, too, sees the law as embedded in life. In her first book, Liberalizing Contracts, she posited a relational liberalism that was not a Polanyian defense against liberalism or living in a capitalist society, but rather a form of implementation of a market economy in which older ideas of status and relationships were preserved, not destroyed. Her exemplary case is the marriage contract, which both in literature and the law is hardly a simple matter of rational choice between atomistic individuals, but embeds status relations of class and gender, and could perhaps even incite new understandings of mobility and authority. In this, although she doesn't cite him, she seems to be aligning with Durkheim's view of the marriage contract as indicative of the non-contractual foundations of the contractual. I ransacked the book. I found no reference to Durkheim, so you'll have to tell us later about whether that was a deliberate omission or whether you're happy to go along with the non-contractual foundations of the contractual. But also, it seems to me that Anat's argument aligns, in a lesser extent, with Melinda Cooper's recent, harsher evocation of the exceptional terms of the marriage contract in her book Family Values, involving some forms of irrevocable consent and the imperative of inalienable labor. In Anat's new book, The One to Hand, similar questions are at stake in the way in which advertising broaches both matters of rational choice between atomistic individuals and also extra-rational promises of fantasy and imagination, if not often love. In fact, Anat explicitly proposes that advertising incites some similar fantasies of mobility and democratized authority that she attributed to the marriage contract. Here she contributes to a burgeoning literature on the enchantment or re-enchantment of capitalism that challenges Weber's theses on the disenchantment of capitalism by asserting the persistence of enchantment in everyday life and its entanglement with, rather than distinction from, protocols of rationality. Consumption is never a matter simply of meeting needs or securing value for money. It always invokes fantasy, what Anat calls the will to enchantment, And in the age of mass advertising, fantasy is promoted to hitherto unimaginable levels. The place allotted to the law here is, however, very different to its place in her account of the marriage contract. Rather than embracing and accommodating the non-contractual foundations of the contractual, the law's approach to advertising is a straightforward piece of boundary work, the disavowal of enchantment. The law did not deny the scope for enchantment in market relations, but ruled such adventures as outside its own province. In this, the law allied not with market makers, but with experts, usually scientists and professionals, who sought to rope off legitimate rational claims from the necessary free play of fantasy involved in market exaggerations. And that illustrates this most vividly through the application of the doctrine of puffery. A puff, a kind of unbelievable claim for a product, is not an actionable promise. A puff for patent medicine is not, for example, a promise of cure. The irony, as she shows it, is that the law, by roping off the realm of rationality for itself, and also, as Anat says, helping to constitute the idea of modernity as disenchanted, I mean, actually, it's a beautiful piece of intellectual history. Why do we assume, or not just because of Weber, why do we assume that modernity is disenchanted? Well, actually, this roping off of this disavowal of enchantment by the law has contributed to that. And this act of disavowal left both advertisers and consumers largely free from the constraints of law to enchant, fantasize, and imagine. Advertisers seemed aware of this as a risk. As she argues in her final chapter, they developed regimes of self-regulation aimed at checking enchantment, constituting their own forms of expertise in psychological science, and allocating more of their resources to branding and reputation management. The law did not worry, but why not? Presumably because its course was dictated by some of its own internal preferences and path dependencies. It was simply not equipped to police human psychology, or even to fathom it, as late-stage advertisers did. Its belief in the legitimacy of the profit motive drove it to accept all sorts of non-rational and socially damaging consequences of greed and avarice as outside the remit of the law. There's an interesting contrast here with the marriage contract. The non-contractual elements of the marriage contract were accepted and clung to in the law well beyond the 19th century. And this is again the point of Melinda Cooper's book, which argues that even neoliberal legal scholars of the Chicago School hold that freedom of contract cannot exist without the ostensibly natural, non-contractual obligations of family. It must have helped that for most of the 19th century, the property implications of the marriage contract were minimized by the preponderance of the unpropertied, and even in the middle class, the exclusion of married women from property rights. So you didn't have to worry about the property implications because there were none. There was a consumption dimension in this too. Under coverture, married women were entitled to contract debts for necessaries, but not for anything else that their fevered, fragile imaginations might covet. But these exclusions no longer applied at the end of the 19th century. And I want to end here with just a question, really, to Anat, which inevitably plunges us further into the 20th century. It's something terrible about all comments on historical books. They always say, well, what happened next? Or, well, what happened before? And I wrote a book about country houses that went back to the 18th century, and I thought, God, that was a long way back. And all the early modernists said, oh, but in the 17th century, in the 16th century. Anyway, I'm afraid I'm going to do this too. What happens next? These exclusions no longer applied at the end of the 19th century, and must surely have troubled legal thinkers who saw enchantment running rampant outside their province. Rising living standards for the mass of the people and married women's property rights were bringing millions more people into the ambit of luxurious consumption, and thus of advertising. Perhaps surprisingly, given her general sensitivity to issues of class and gender, Anat does not press much on this issue. She's found other dimensions to which she says play the role that class and gender played in the marriage contract. In the Carlyle case, I have to mention a case. I'm in the law school, I've got to mention a case. all questions about the Carlyle case directed to Anat Rosenberg. In the Carlyle case, which helped to establish puffery as a defense, the suggestibility of the female plaintiff was itself a point of interest. As one commentator put it, mind had a habit of triumphing over matter, especially the female mind. But that hazardous suggestibility did not in any way impugn puffery as it might have done. As Anat shows, it was only when suggestibility led directly to criminal acts, abortion, say, or gambling, that it became a problem. The law had to sort of lower the boom. Otherwise, it was just a matter of human nature to be accepted resignedly, even humorously. Perhaps this is another illustration of relational, or perhaps more properly, affective liberalism, now stretched to include fully women in the working class, but with the law playing the role not of supporting the non-rational, but of stepping aside and letting it rip. Or did the law, I'm just proposing some alternatives, but maybe Anat will come up with something I had was beyond even my fevered imagination. Or did the law expect that people, even women in the working class, were becoming progressively more rational over time, such that their desires and behaviors would increasingly fall within the province of the law? Or indeed, non-rational behaviors were assumed not to work in the marketplace, and they didn't work in the marketplace even when millions of people were now thronging the marketplace with those non-rational ideas. But still, it seems to me that there must have been something more than could be handled by advertisers with their psychological science and their branding. There must have been more of a crisis of the legal doctrines triggered by the incursion of these millions and millions of new, formerly irrational consumers into their field of vision. With that, I will leave the questions open for Anat to answer in the discussion afterwards. I want to say a shout out to my friend Erica Rappaport, who I see up in the upper left-hand corner. I have to apologize. I think that this was originally scheduled for December, this event, and I brought it all crashing down to the ground with a case of COVID. And if that's meant that Erica couldn't join us, I owe her a personal apology, but I'm sure with the wonders of modern technology that her contribution will come through loud and clear. Anyway, thank you again for inviting me, and many congratulations on that.